Here we are with Mary Jane DeRigo. It's Super Bowl Sunday, February 2nd, 2014, and we're going to do a short interview to learn a little bit more about her.
That sounds great. What do you think about that, Graham?
Well, first of all, I would correct you. I'm Mary Jane DeRigo now, but I was Mary Vanderwater when I was born in 1926. And if you ever breed horses, you would say she's sired by Vanderwater out of a Stapleton. My mother was a Stapleton, my father was a Vanderwater, but he was also half Scotch, and my mother was half Irish and half French. So you've got four bloods in me. Then I married Steve DeRigo, happily, fortunately. We were both lucky. And so our kids are half Italian, and the other is 1/8, I think. Is my math correct?
I believe so.
That's important, that lineage, yeah. And I knew all my grandparents. I knew them all. Not everybody is that lucky. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, you've started on it, but could you tell us a little bit more about where you came from, how you came to be in York and also Boca?
That's a long question.
A little bit about your beginning.
That's a long question. Well, I was firstborn. I was lucky. And when my sister came, I was 3 and I hated her. Who needed her? And my poor mother, she no sooner got pregnant from my brother Peter when, what do they call it, Black Tuesday came. Imagine carrying a baby 9 months and the depression is. And my father had an 8th grade education. He sold real estate, only commission. I don't know if he made any money at all. And finally, when my brother was like 2.5, my sister 3.5, and I was like 6.5, he had been brought up on farms. His family moved every year, if you can feature that. Oh. And so he knew about farm life, and he bought a farm so that he knew we could eat. And my mother went from a very, very comfortable family in Flushing. She was one of 9, up to this farm. And when they first moved into that shell of a house, a shell, no insulation, there was no plumbing, there was no electricity, there was no heat. It was just like a chicken coop, but cute. And so this is the first winter. This is 1933. But it had 3 things. It had mice, it had rats, and it had bed bugs.
Oh.
And bed bugs are awful. They're in the beds, and they bite you all night long. And she would go around with a spray can trying to kill them. But they multiplied, you know, the eggs. You don't kill eggs with a spray. So finally they had to have the house fumigated. I don't know where they got the money for it, but I still remember we went out to lunch that day. It was a big thing. And I had a can of either Campbell's or Heinz tomato soup and one of those Kaiser Roads with the nice black seeds on top and a pat of butter. It was one of the highlights of my life. It was. You have no idea. We were in the diner, the Walden Diner, all lined up. And we had to wait a certain number of hours, and then we could get back in the house. And they killed the bed bugs. They did. They succeeded. So all right, they don't have bed bugs, but they still have the mice and the rats. And you'd have to chain the trap to something because the rat would find a way to get away. I don't know how many rats they cost. But this is a bitter cold house, and my mother had to keep the kitchen warm, which was 8 by 12, give or take. She put a blanket over the doorway, so that room was warm. I walked to school a mile, and she had Ann and Peter in that one room that first winter, 3.5 and 2.5, no television, no electricity, so there's no radio, there's no telephone, there's nothing. And she had to walk out to a well, which is about 100 feet away, to bring in water. The outhouse was in the outside, and we had a pot under the beds. And that upstairs was no insulation. That house was cold, ice cold. Winters were much tougher then. So there was no heat except in that kitchen. And if she let the fire go out, then we started out, -0 again. But that was how she lived that first winter. And looking back on it, she had to have been a very gutsy, brave woman. She really had fantastic character. And yet, she never complained. We never knew what a traumatic change it was for her. She came from a very comfortable family. My grandfather was a contractor. He built schools for the city of New York. He built 250 homes in Flushing. He was a very successful man. He had the first car in Flushing, but he never drove it. His 5 sons chauffeured him. I'd have liked that. And he was quite a guy. He made his own elderberry wine. And he finally built a house for his family, a magnificent, full basement, first floor, second floor, attic, all with bathrooms. And I remember the last Christmas before we moved up to the farm, my Uncle Speck, who was 6'5", came in the living room window from the front porch dressed as Santa Claus with a bag of presents. And in the foyer of this house, which was, that foyer was, that had to have been 14, 15 feet wide. And there was an oriental rug on the floor with a border. And that was one of the first years they came out with these darling little play cars. They had light on them. So all we children were on our hands and knees the whole Christmas night, going around the borders with our cars with a light on. What a Christmas we had. Is that enough for now, Paul?
Now let's keep going.
Go ahead.
So tell us a little bit about your parents and how they met, and a little bit about your grandparents.
My parents met at the Flushing Boat Club. My mother's family was successful. They were very comfortable. I wouldn't say they were money, they weren't, but they were very comfortable. And they belonged to the Flushing Boat Club. And my mother would paddle her canoe into Flushing Bay, and she'd swim down there. So my father had a friend who also was a member, and he took my father to the Flushing Boat Club one day. And I have a picture of that he took of my mother. It was 19, they were both 27, and they met in 1919. He had just come back from the war after 2 years over there in France. And he kept, I think, 17 planes in the air. That was his job. Sometimes he would work all day, all night, and all day. And he has a citation from John Pershing. So he had a very successful war. And prior to the war, he built cars with his father. They built racing cars. They built about 175 of them. And they did win races. But at that time, everybody was getting into the car manufacturing business. It was a big new thing. And they finally went bankrupt. There was so much competition. And I guess not too many people wanted to buy a race car. They wanted a car to go get the groceries in. But anyway, that's how they met at the Flushing Boat Club.
Now they had the opportunity to work with Chrysler.
Oh, my grandfather was asked by Chrysler to go into business with him.
Your mother's father.
My father's father.
Your father's father, okay.
Who built the cars. And grandfather said no. And then during World War I, my father met Eddie Rickenbacker, and he started Eastern Airlines.
Mm-hmm.
And Pop was in the 95th Aero Squadron with him, and he wanted my father to go in business with him. And my father said no. They were both very independent. They did not want to work for anybody. And so that was, but they were smart men. They were very smart men. And had my father been educated, who knows what he could have done. So those were my mother and father. Then my mother, before she married my father, they courted for 5 years.
5 years?
Yes. Well, my father had an 8th grade education. He didn't have a job, and things were tough after that war. And so they courted. And the big problem was religion. My mother was Catholic, and Pop was a black Protestant. And there was a lot of you-know-what. Anyway, so my mother and 3 girlfriends, they had a Model A or a Model T, and they drove across the country, those 4 women, by themselves. They set up a tent at night. My mother was really, really ahead of her time. And before that, she taught phys ed up in Herkimer County, which is a very wintry county. And she'd live with a family for 2 weeks and teach the classroom exercises, and then she'd go to another family. It was a hard way to make a living. So she did that, and then she drove across the country, and they were out in Nebraska someplace. They came to a fork in the road. No sign, no nothing. So they went to the right, and it stopped. So she turned around and come back, try this one. And that one, they drove all across the country. Then they sold the car in California, and Helen Hayslip and my mother came back on the train together. I don't know what happened to the other two women. And they stopped at Williams, and they took the train up to Grand Canyon. And they rode the mules down in 1922, which was the year Phantom Ranch opened.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother talked about that all her life. So I heard about Grand Canyon.
Your family has a long history of love of the
That's
Grand
right.
Canyon,
Yeah.
which continues to this day.
Yes. So then in 1950, when Ann, Peter, and I drove across the country, we looked down the canyon from South Rim. And then in 1992, my sister and I went down the Colorado River in dories, which are oar-powered. Then 21 years later, we did the river trip.
Mm-hmm.
Just this last summer.
Yeah. So it was, the canyon's been in our lives a long, long time. But that moving to the farm was the making of me. When you grow up in the Depression on a farm, you learn to milk the cow at 9 because you're the oldest. You have to help your mother. Your father's trying to make a living. So he was gone all week, always, my father. Mom kept a little Colt 22 under her pillow because people would come around wanting a meal or wanting something. And so for her protection, she had a Colt 22, and she knew how to shoot.
She never had to use it, hopefully.
No, I still have the gun. I ain't telling where it is. I'd probably be arrested.
Do you know how to use it?
No, and I have no intention of using it. I
Good.
don't need it here, but my mother needed it there. And she had to learn to run a garden. She had to learn how to can, make jelly. She was very frugal, very frugal. She learned to take wool and wash it and card it and make quilts so that we would be warm. She learned to make slip covers. She learned how to wallpaper, paint. She learned to milk the cow too. We had pigs. Homegrown pork is delicious.
Is that when you had the horse too?
Oh, Barney Goo-Goo, yeah. Oh, he came up soon after we bought that farm because we needed him to plow the garden, to cut the hay. Oh yeah,
So
Barney.
he was a useful
Oh,
little guy.
And he was gorgeous. He was gorgeous. I have a picture of him.
How did you guys acquire Barney Goo Goo?
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how he got his name, but it suited him. Barney Goo-Goo was huge and he was strong. He pulled an ice wagon. Ice is heavy. It's very heavy. But people began to get refrigerators, so he was unemployed. I don't know how my father got involved with him. We don't know how he got him up there. We certainly couldn't have afforded a truck. Our mortgage was $850 a month. And when that last payment was made, it was just such a relief. You have no idea how it is to work with no money.
$8.50.
A month mortgage. And we finally got it paid. And I don't know to this day how long it was, or what they paid for the farm, or did know what they paid for that farm. It was 20 acres. It was cute as fun. And can you show that picture of the farm if I ever get it?
Yeah, of
On
course.
that?
Yeah, of course.
We can add it at some time. Yeah, okay.
Did you ride Barney Goo Goo ever?
Oh, no.
He wasn't a riding horse.
Oh, no. He wouldn't have permitted you up there. No.
He was a workhorse.
You harnessed him up and you kept talking to him the whole time because it was so quiet up there that anything would startle him. He was used to the Third Avenue elevator over his head where he pulled his wagon. And
So when you were living in that house, tell me about your education. Tell me about your schooling.
Education. It was a one-room schoolhouse. St. Andrews was his name. We had one teacher Mr. Stryker, he was a little nervous. He would go home to a wife and 5 daughters, and the wife was sick. He made guts teaching school. There were 40 kids in that classroom, 40, grades 1 through 8. So you'd call out 4th grade arithmetic, and whoever was in 4th grade, they'd go up to the front seats. You know, those little wooden seats, and you'd sit there and have your 4th grade arithmetic class, and then 5th grade geography. And the bathrooms were outside. We had outhouses. And then finally, they put an inside bathroom. I don't know whether it was 1 or 2. But when you went in, you turned the card to in, so the class would know that somebody was in there. And you could turn the card. There was no lock on it, no nothing. Oh my God. Oh. And Mr. Stryker, to keep his sanity, he would leave us at lunchtime and go down and listen to the news. His parents lived right there. But he left 40 kids from grades 1 to 8 in that yard. There was one boy, he was a bully. And he made me nervous. But I tell you, we used to play double dutch. Oh, that was such fun. And there were other games that we would play. And then, when you got into 7th grade, you went into Walden Central School. And meanwhile, my mother, in desperation, put me in a public kindergarten, like in January. I was not 5, I was a March baby, so I was too young. So I went there, and then she transferred me to a Catholic school, St. Andrews, and they put me right in 1st grade. And then when we went up to the country, I took 3rd and 4th, or 4th and 5th grade. Anyway, I was always 2 years younger than everybody else. I'll tell you right now, don't ever do that to your children. You want them along with the age. And the earlier you're born in the year, the better off you are. And if you're the oldest, it's a disadvantage because you don't have those other siblings to learn from. Everything was a little negative for me. I was the oldest. I was too young for everybody I was in school with. And my father, can I go here? No. Can I go to this? No. I couldn't do anything. So then I got to be a cheerleader when he found out there were night games.
You were a cheerleader?
In high school. And he said, you're not going to night games. And that was the end of it. That was the end of my cheerleading. I think I cheered at 1 game because he didn't want me. And then the first party I went to, and he found out we played spin the bottle. You're not going. That was the end of it.
Did you kiss any boys?
I can't remember now, but just the fact that we played that game. And then I went to Cornell. I had never had a first date. I had never been out to dinner. I had never had a date when I went to Cornell, and I was 16 and a half. I was wet behind the ear. And
when was the age that you typically would get asked on a date?
I have no idea. What would I know about it? We lived in the country. You got off the school bus and you were home.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about your first date.
At Cornell?
Yeah.
Oh, he was sweet. He was a nice boy. But he was a little late, and then I decided that I wouldn't go out with him. But our nice, I guess she was a senior, she said, oh, Mary. And that's when I started to be called Mary Jane, because there were so many Marys. So I got to Mary Jane. Mary Jane, he's a little late. Give him a chance. So, okay, so I went out with him. I can't remember anything else about it. That was my first date.
What was his name? You don't know?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. But I was a freshman. I must have met him at a mixer, you know, at Cornell, at the street. They would have freshman mixers. But I went to college with a suitcase and a metal tennis racket, which was my Uncle Speck's tennis racket. And you had to take something. So I took tennis because they had the racket.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had whatever. And I learned how to keep score, I learned how to serve, I just learned how to play tennis. And then at the end of the class, we had, you competed. So I end up playing a girl who's played tennis a lot. But she had been up all night getting back from a vacation or something. She was really tired. And the teacher, he walked by me, he said, "You can beat her." And I did. But I never played tennis in my life. But you see, that's mentoring. And you plant a seed in the kid's mind, then you can do that. And chances are he'll do it. It's very, very powerful. That's why these people have mentors. They work with them and talk them into things.
So how old were you when you met your husband?
Well, I met him in 1950, so I was born in 1926. You do the math.
How
I was
many
24.
how many years after Cornell was that?
Oh, I supported myself for 6 years because I went Pearl Harbor, right? Then I went the following September, so it was 45.
Okay.
1942, pardon me. But the fact that the war was on, we went 12 months a year. So I did 4 years of college in 3 years. So I got out at 19 and 3 months. And I taught school for 3 years, and then I was in my self-promotion job for 3 years. I supported myself for 6 years.
What did you teach?
You taught for 3 years?
Home economics.
Home economics.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why you're so good at everything.
Not necessarily.
That's part of it.
That takes years of practice to
Yeah.
get good at anything. But, what was I going to say? Steve and I were both ready to get married. He had been in the service for 3 years. He was in the Pacific for 19 months, being, all of that. And then he had run his business for 3 years. Steve was always very mature.
How did you meet?
On my job. That's a long story. You might want to do that some other time.
Okay.
Because that's an interesting story, how I met him. And it's a little detailed.
We can do that later on today.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's stop for now and we'll continue in a little bit.